The Orton effect was created or invented by photographer Michael Orton back in the 70s or 80s, I'm not sure which. It was a technique where using transparency film he would create these kind of dreamy images in his effort to simulate watercolor paintings. To create the Orton effect, Michael Orton would set his camera up on a tripod and compose his image. Using transparency film, he would overexpose a shot. I'm not sure how much. I suppose it depended on the scene and subject matter. He would take a second identical shot, but this time he would move the lens out of focus so the image was quite blurry. He would then stack those two transparencies on top of each other so the final effect would be an image of somewhat normal density with a lot of the detail of the sharp slide showing through, but adding this mystical glow from the blurry slide. And it was a real effective technique, and he became quite famous for it. During the evolution of digital photography, we have tried to replicate many of the techniques that we used when shooting film or in a darkroom, and the Orton effect is no exception. I'm going to show 3 different ways to replicate or simulate the Orton effect. The first way is the most common method I see taught through the internet and other places, and it's a very effective way to simulate the Orton effect. The second way that I'm going to show is a little bit of a modification of another method that I found, and I like this one because it's very, very subtle. You might not even be able to see it on the screen that well. And the final method is something that I don't think anybody's ever shown, and so I've kind of nicknamed it the Wayne Fox method of the Orton effect. And to me, it replicates the original technique the closest because I'm actually starting with raw files and I'm manipulating the images similar to what would be going on in the camera. It has the added benefit of being very non-destructive and completely editable, so you can tweak all of your various settings until you get a result that you like before you commit them. Let me mention that because this is very subtle, and when you shrink a video like this down, most of the effect will disappear. So I've recorded this video in 1080 high def. You might want to set your stream up to that high and go full screen, or at least get a large enough window so you can really see what's going on. So here we go with the first method of the Orton effect. Before beginning, it's important that you have a single layer with all the information. If you have a single layer file like this, then you're good to go. If you happen to have a file with multiple layers, let's put a couple of fake layers in here. You either need to flatten the file or you need to create what's called a stamped copy. If you want to preserve these other layers, then to create a stamped copy, you'll click on the top layer, hold down Shift, Option, Command if you're on a Mac, or Shift, Alt, Control if you're on a PC, and hit the letter E. Now this layer here has all of the information of all the other layers merged into one. I'm going to use my history to go back and eliminate those since I don't need them. So the first thing we need to do is make a copy of this base layer, and I'm going to do that by hitting Command J. I want to keep this layer as it is for blending purposes later on, so we always want the original to be untouched. I need to make this layer a screen version, but it has to be in normal blending mode. Most videos I've seen talk about using Apply Image to do that, so I'll show that. Let's call this layer base so we have an idea which one it is. And to do Apply Image, you will go over here into the Image menu, select Apply Image. It's important that you select the same layer as the base layer here. Sometimes it won't make a difference, sometimes it will. And then you also need to make sure you select screen mode from this blending and hit OK. So that's one way to do it. As you can see now, I have a layer, it's in normal mode, and yet it's a screen version of the original. I'm going to hit Command Z because I think an easier way to do that is just hit Command J, change the blending mode to screen, and then hit Command E or Control E to merge that down. And now I have the exact same thing with just a couple of keystrokes. Once I've done that, I need to make a copy of this layer, so I'm going to hit Command J or Control J. I'm going to call this layer our blur layer because it's the one we're going to blur. So now what you see is I have 2 layers that are both lighter than the original, just like the transparencies that Michael Orton shot. Now to make things clear, I'm going to take these 2 layers and I'm going to use the menu here to create new group from layers, and the reason I use the menu is because I want to give it a name quickly. So now this is our Orton Effect layer, and we can turn it off and on once we're done, or we can even fade it with the opacity slider. We're ready to do our blur now, and to do that I'm going to go ahead and blend my two slides together first so I can preview the effect. So I'm going to hit multiply. You'll notice it adds quite a bit of contrast. And now we're ready to blur this layer. We're going to go filter, blur, Gaussian blur. The small window up here shows the effect of just the blur layer, and it gives you an idea how much you're blurring that original layer. Okay. The larger window, of course, previews the overall effect. I would recommend you set the larger window to 50% if you're on a normal resolution monitor. If you're on a high resolution monitor, such as a 4K monitor or a Retina display, you might want to set this at 100% because this really gives you an idea what it will look like when it's printed. A lot of times you want to use a fairly exaggerated effect. I usually watch this window to make sure there's at least a little bit of detail and I'm not smearing it too badly. But I want it to be pretty strong, and then I can blend some of it back out later. So that's one reason that doing this digitally is kind of cool. We have some controls that Michael Orton didn't have with film. That looks pretty good, so let's hit OK. And now we've created our Orton effect. And as I said, if you think it's a little too strong, we can take the overall grouping and then pull the opacity down to blend it back into the original. So you can pull it back so it's very subtle. Let's go and go to 50% so you can see it a little bit better. You can get it so it's very, very subtle, or you can leave it very strong, similar to what Michael Orton achieved with the transparency film. So that's method one of the Orton effect. Now another advantage we have, because it's digital, is we can selectively remove the effect from parts of the image. And after I show the third method, I'll show a couple of ideas on things you might try to do that. Method two is more subtle than the other method, and it's probably not a true replication of the effect. Let's rename this to method one so we can keep it and we can compare the two methods later. So in method two, I'm going to again duplicate my background, and I'm going to rename that to blur. And then I'm going to duplicate that layer, and I'm going to rename it to screen. Now this method requires the background to remain because the layers above all affect all the way down through the background. Let's put those two in a grouping again. And we need to change the blur layer to multiply and the screen layer to screen. This will normally, let's turn the original off here. This normally will make the image appear a little bit lighter. And so a lot of times this screen layer, you're going to want to pull the opacity down just a little bit. Whoops, there we go. That's pretty close. It's usually around 70 to 75%, somewhere in there. Now that we've done that, we want to select our blur layer, and we're ready to hit Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And again, here in this window, we can preview the effect of just the blur layer. And again, I recommend you zoom into 50% on a normal display or 100% on a high resolution display so you can preview the overall image. And you can see this method is much more subtle, and a lot of times you'll have to dial this blur up quite a bit higher than you did on the other method. So let's go about 20, and maybe 30. That's close enough. And now if we turn this layer back off and on, you'll see how very, very subtle it is. And sometimes that's useful because you just want a real subtle approach. You can vary the overall density of the image by tweaking the screen layer opacity. And of course you can also blend some of the effect back out by tweaking the opacity of the two of the grouping. Normally this method is so subtle that you're not going to take much of it out. So that's method 2 of the Orton effect. Method 3 of the Orton effect is something that I've never seen taught. I've nicknamed it the Wayne Fox method of the Orton effect. I don't know if anybody else has ever taught it, but I believe it has some advantages over the other two. Normally, to do this effect, you'll start with your raw file and all of the modifications that you've made in Lightroom. It also works with TIFF and JPEG files as well. Because I'm trying to duplicate a film technique, I think starting with a raw file is kind of cool. So we're going to take this image over because the one we was just working with was not a raw file. It was actually a panorama merge. So we're going to go here and we're going to edit in Photoshop, but we're going to open it as a smart object in Photoshop. The advantage of opening it as a smart object is it's still a raw file, and that means we can double click the smart object and it will open in Adobe Camera Raw, and all of the settings that we've done in Lightroom can be reapplied to the raw image data itself, and that's a feature that we're going to take advantage of. So the first thing we need to do is make a copy of the raw file, but we have to make it a little different way, because if we just hit Command or Control J, those two copies will be linked. So we need to make it a different way, and the easiest way to do that is just to right click and then go New Smart Object via Copy. This means that these two copies are now independent of each other. We're going to call this one our base. Now we need a copy of this layer, and this time we can do Command J, because one of the things we want to do is both of these files will synchronize with all the changes that we make, and this layer of course ends up becoming our blur. We're going to put these two in a grouping again, and we'll call this Wayne Fox Orton, and we're going to double click one of these two layers, and we're going to overexpose our image. Now the amount you need to overexpose varies. We're going to overexpose this particular image one stop. The cool part is that you can keep changing your exposure until you get it to where you like it, because all of the things we're doing now are non-destructive. Now notice as we do that both of these two copies lightened. So we now have an image that is a stop lighter, but it's not a screen mode image, it's our raw file. And that exposure adjustment was made similar to opening the lens up and shooting it overexposed. So we need to turn this top layer to multiply. And now we're ready to blur this layer. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And again, this window is showing us the effect on the layer that we're on. And you'll notice it doesn't take a lot of blur to get this image pretty blurry. And we'll zoom in here again to 50%. And this image previews the effect in the overall image. Now the results of this one are similar to the first method, but I think it's a little bit more accurate, and I think it duplicates the original Orton effect the closest. So in this case, I only need a blur of about 7 or 8. I don't need to go very high. I could go quite high and exaggerate it, but you'll see how that's bleeding in too much, and that's what I watch for. I watch for the color bleeding into parts that I want to kind of leave pure. So I'm going to go about there. 9.5 is fine. And now we have our Orton effect done. This is before and after. And let's go ahead and zoom back out a little bit. And let's go before and after. So now that we've done that, you can see that there's a couple of cool things we can do. First of all, we can decide that our density is off a little bit. And we literally can just double click one of these two smart objects and add or subtract a little bit more density. The other thing that I usually do with this method, which I think is pretty cool, is when I go into here, I'll normally pull the whites down and the blacks up a little bit, and that will reduce some of the dark spots and make the contrast a little bit more pleasant. I can even get very extreme in that if I want, It's hard to preview it in this image, but I can pull my shadows up quite a bit and my blacks up a little more and hit OK. And you'll see how the shadows lightened up. There's before and there's after. So because I can tweak the raw file, it's as though I shot it differently, which is really, really cool. It's as though you could change your transparency settings on the fly when you were shooting it with film. The other thing I can do is I can change the amount of blur. I can reduce the blur or increase it. So this method is very, very non-destructive and allows me to tweak it, and I can either tweak it till I like it and then flatten the image, or I can save it in this state so I can always make a change later. So that's one reason I like this particular way to do the Orton effect, because of all the changes. Now, if you're using one of the other methods, you can also convert your layers to smart objects before you apply changes, such as the Gaussian blur, and that will allow you to also redo the blur later if you want. So that's the Wayne Fox method of the Orton effect. So with most images, you're going to want to remove part of the Orton effect from some of the image. One of the nice things we have about doing digital. And I would guess a lot of the time it's just a matter of painting it out or using some simple masking techniques in Photoshop. Here I'll just add a mask. I don't like what it's doing in this building. So let me just go ahead and grab my brush and let's just paint it out very quickly. All right, I'll warn you that the brush, the circle doesn't show the actual edge of your feather. You can see that I've got a feather. It's the middle of the transition, so you kind of have to take that in mind. Of course, in this case, if I get a little bit into the trees, it won't hurt anything. So just to give you a quick idea, let's zoom in here, and you can see that with the Orton effect off, we have a much sharper, more detailed shot of the building, and yet down in the Christmas lights in the water, we're able to maintain that Orton effect. This isn't affecting it much. And I would need to be more careful, and you can see that I need to, some of the building I would have to paint more, but I just wanted to show a quick demo. So that's the most common way you're going to do it. I wanted to show two techniques I use, which are maybe something that you haven't seen before, because I found them to be very effective in removing, especially for the Orton effect. And this image lets me demonstrate both of those. First of all, in this image, I would prefer the shadows to not lose as much detail. To me, the Orton effect is about the light part of the images seeming to glow, as though they're glowing with light, and the shadows I would prefer to have a little less of that effect going on. And I also would prefer to see the detail of the trunks of these trees show through either all the way or at least a lot more. So there are two techniques I can do to accomplish that, and they're actually easier than you would think. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to apply a luminosity mask to our Orton effect, and that will allow us to remove it from basically any brightness level of the image. In this case, we want to get the darkest darks. So I'm going to go to my channels palette. I'm going to Control or Command click on the RGB channel, and you'll see that I have a selection now. This selection is based on the brightness values of the pixels, and it's probably the upper 20%. If I hold Shift and then Command or Control, each time it will add a level further, so that's 40%, 60%, 80%. And now I've mainly got the dark pixels are excluded. If I go back to my layers palette now and I go to my Orton method and I just hit my mask icon, you'll see that I have this really cool mask that's not pure black, but it's based on the darkness of the pixels, and it effectively took the effect out of the darkest part of the image. Now in this case, I think it didn't go quite far enough, so I'm going to delete it. And I recommend when you're doing this, you actually count your number of clicks. So if you want to do it again, you can just go one more click. So we're going to click once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. I think last time I only clicked 4. and maybe I'll go one more click. So I'm really going to only affect the darkest parts of the image here. Go to my Orton method, layer, and now you can see that it's really affected just the shadows. Now maybe it's affected them too much, and that's fine, because all you got to do is go to your properties of your mask and pull that density down a little bit, and you can pull it back, and you can really have a lot of fine control. So that's how I take care of the shadows. The tree trunks are a little different, and you might have an image where you've got some very light areas that you want to pull the detail back in. Let me just turn it off and on. And to do that, I would use a technique called, I would use the select by color range option. I need to make sure that I have a normal layer selected, and I will click somewhere in these trees. I'm going to turn the quick mask off. Click somewhere in the whites of the trunks. I'm going to turn my plus dropper on, easier than holding shift, and I'm going to start clicking and sampling a lot of these areas. In this particular image, it's nice because there really are no colors similar to these trunks anywhere else in the image. And so it's actually pretty easy to isolate these tree trunks. I usually will grab the quick mask and look, because that really helps you understand what you've got selected. And this looks pretty good. That's where I want the detail to come back through. So I'm just going to hit OK and go to my mask. I want to make sure that I have some feather in this. So you need to select your rectangle marquee, and then make sure your feathers, somewhere between 5 and 15, depending on how high a resolution the file is, because we don't want this hard edge. Once we do that, we'll make sure our mask is selected, and we just fill it with black, or if you want to use less, you can apply an 80% gray or a 70% gray. If you want it to be not 100%, you can just put in a different level of gray. So this is before, this is after. Let's go back before, after. Let me zoom in here. Before, after. So now my trees pretty much look like the original shot, and yet I've got this really nice Orton effect going on, only affecting the kind of parts of the image I would like to glow. So those are two techniques that are very, very useful to help you blend out part of the luminosity mask. Obviously, you can use any of the masking capabilities of Photoshop to do this. The key point is, most of the time, it's nice to pull some of that back out. Thanks for listening to the video. I hope that you'll find the Wayne Fox method of the Orton effect effective. I think it is by far the most useful and powerful because it is so controllable and editable. And until next time, thanks.